There is a chat option that you can make use of at any time during the meeting. So if you have a question that you think you might forget by the time I invite questions, you can write it on the chat. And then it will be recorded and somebody can alert me to it during the course of the meeting. My plan, such as it is to go through the steps that I would take to weather something. And then if I remember to stop people if they've got questions. Sometimes I get carried away, so I might forget to stop. What I'm going to be working on is a Bachmann C-class, a Wainwright C-class. And just to check that it's working, I'm now going to swap my camera for the one that's looking at the spray booth. So there you should be able to see the state of the locomotive at the moment. And that's what we'll be looking at during the course of the session. I'm hoping that the changes between cameras won't take too long. I see I've got one question already about only spraying in the summer. That's an interesting question, and it's probably worth answering that right now. There is a significant difference between airbrushing a complete model and weathering. If you're weathering a complete model, then the chances are you want the circumstances to be optimum to get a nice even layer of paint. In terms of weathering, we're not really bothered about that because we're only going to be using very small quantities in very small areas. Is it a fallacy or best practice? I don't think either of those really apply, if you'll excuse me saying so. I think the reason people say you should only airbrush in the summer is because of the temperature and the humidity. Some paints used for laying down a complete color coat need a certain environment to work satisfactorily. Hopefully that answers that question. Graham? Does that answer your question, Graham? Unmute yourself and say...
Thanks, Mick. Thank you.
Okay, splendid. Okay, before I start doing anything else, I must emphasize that everything you see today, I am demonstrating because it works for me. That does not necessarily mean that it is the only best way. It works for me. If you go into weathering in any great detail or any great length, you will develop a way of doing it yourself. And I encourage that. Weathering is a very personal thing. Once you start weathering, you may follow someone else's guidelines or read someone else's book, but I would hope that you would experiment while you're doing it to find a way of doing things that suits you, your materials, your experience, the picture you've got in your head, all that sort of thing. Peter Jackson asked a question, do any of the techniques I'll be using vary according to scale? No, the techniques don't. The techniques are the same regardless of scale. The materials might change and the size of your spray booth might change, but for the most part, the techniques are exactly the same. And I'm glad Peter brought up the subject of techniques. The way I work in weathering is to only ever use very small quantities of material at a time. So it doesn't matter whether it's paint, pigment, or a wash, it's only ever a small amount. And the main reasoning behind that is because it's easy to add more if you haven't done enough, but it's extremely difficult to take it off if you put on too much. And I would go as far as to say, if I'm working on something and I put on much, I invariably actually take everything off and start again. Might sound a bit drastic, but in my experience, that helps me to get the result I want at the end of the day. And while we're talking about the end of the day, you shouldn't really start a weathering task unless you have something to work from in front of you. I never, no, I'll amend that. I never used to start a job unless I had a picture of the end result in front of me. I've been doing it for a little while now, so I do have pictures in my head rather than pictures in front of me of what I want to achieve. And that's pretty much going to be the case today. I know what I want to achieve, and each step I take will be a process, a step in the process towards doing that. I'm waffling here a bit because I see, well, we have 70 people registered for the event and there are only 61 here. But I'm not, it's now, well, it's nearly 15:15, so I'm not going to wait for the other 10. Maybe they've fallen asleep or something. Okay. Now then, I will turn to the spray booth and start working from there. There will be, I have to turn the spray booth on to get rid of the fumes. We've done a little test and my co-hosts seem to think that we should be all right. My voice will drown out the sound of the fan on the spray booth. If that turns out not to be the case, then we'll have to think of something on the hoof. Actually, what I'd like to do, I'll do a little test here. I've got two cameras that I'm using to look at the area. You've seen one of them with the C-class on the turntable. I'm just going to turn to another camera just to see if you can actually, yeah, that's not too bad, is it? Does that look like a view that everyone can make sense of? Thumbs up to the camera if it looks okay. Okay, more than a dozen, so that will be all right. Okay, that was just a little test. I will.
Engine.
What was? Sorry, I didn't catch that.
It's not in focus.
Focus on the actual engine.
Right. Okay. That camera will only be used for an overall view. I've no intention of taking my smartphone out of its clamp just to change the focus. It's a general view. The one that you will be looking through, I hope, for most of this session is this one here. Okay?
Okay.
Now, hopefully you can see that that is in focus.
Oh, that's great. Yes.
Okay. Right. Preparation then. I'm now facing the spray booth, so got no idea what anyone is doing, saying, or looking at because I can't see you. In order to make sure that when you're working on any subject, you minimize the chance of problems, you must, and I emphasize this, you must make sure that there is no grease or oil inside the body or on the mechanism that could creep out into your perfect weathering job at the end of the day. There is on the Missenden website a PDF which contains important information about that. So if you're ever going to do any weathering, then I'd encourage you to check that out before you make a start. What happens is that the grease that is inserted by the spoonful into the mechanism at the factory is thixotropic. It becomes thin and oily. And when the motion starts, this oily substance is sprayed all over the inside of the body. Some of it you'll be able to see, some of it you won't. But you can bet your sweet life that it will all spread itself over the outside of the body onto your weathering, and you'll end up with tide marks. which are a pain to get rid of. You can remove it, but it's best not to have it there in the first place. So you need to take the locomotive apart and remove all traces of excess oil. I have been asked a few times, won't that make it dry? And the answer is no, you won't get it all off. There will certainly be enough to maintain the smooth running of the mechanism. And if you're a conscientious modeler, then you will have a maintenance routine you follow to clean and lubricate your locomotive on a regular basis. Another thing you should do before you actually start the weathering process is to make sure that all the accessories you want to be on the locomotive have been applied. So brake gear, this one I haven't done it on, but you can see there is no brake gear applied to that at all. But if I was doing this to use on my own railway, then I would have gone through that process, making sure that things like hoses and cups and the brake operating gear, all that sort of thing, are fixed to the locomotive before I start. If the model has been handled a lot before you start weathering, it might be an idea to give it a wipe down with isopropyl alcohol. That, but don't use too much. That will give you a fairly assured situation where there are no oily marks or other such imperfections which will affect the layer of grime that you're going to be applying. Before we go any further, let's just have a look at what it is I'm going to be using today. For simplicity, I'm using 2 rail match paints. And I say simplicity because I normally like to mix my colours before I start. But to keep the length of this session down a bit, I'm going to use rail match frame dirt for the underneath bits, rail match roof dirt for the top bits, and a mixture of the 2 for all the areas in between. And you'll see a little more about that as we go on. So that will be the base colour of dirt that goes on. And once that's on, I'll be moving to pigments. Pigments is the phrase I use when I refer to weathering powders. A lot of people, I think, refer to them as weathering powders, but not a lot of people. I'm going to use 4 colours. If I turn the pots up like this, you might be able. Yes, you can. You can see the difference in the colours. We start off with dark mud. It's called dark mud. That is the colour that I would expect to see round about the running parts, the underframe, and the wheels of a locomotive. Not in sequence, but the next one is track brown or track rust, and that's a colour that I use to represent rusty areas or more grimed in dirt. Then there's black smoke, which you can probably see is not actually totally black. It has a grey and maybe slightly brown tinge to it. And finally, there is this one here called rubble dust. That is well, you can see it's a pale grey brown colour. And you'll see why I use those and where in due course. I usually start on the underframe. The reason for that is it is arguably the most awkward part of the whole thing, and I like to get it out of the way to start with. Some people start on the upper parts and work their way towards the underframe, but I find that I have to wait too long for things to dry. I have found over the years that the easiest way to work on an underframe is to use a cradle. And the cradle is used quite simply hold the model upside down while I work on it. If you just bear with me a moment, I need to change the camera view on my screen. I need to do that so I can make sure you can see what I'm doing. During the course of weathering the underframe, you need to be sure that the wheels turn. Now, on this model with the tender, that happens quite readily. Some tenders have pickup from the tender wheels, and that means they don't turn particularly freely. And the driving wheels turn, and for that, I just use a 9-volt battery because the terminals are just about the right distance apart for 4mm-ish gauge. It does work most of the time for 2mm scale models, but of course there aren't very many 7mm scale models whose wheels are that far apart. So for that, I have a pair of pieces of rail attached to a chocolate block connector. One pair being that far apart, and the other side of the chocolate block, they are bent, so they are the correct width apart. And all this is used for is to turn the wheels during the course of the weathering process, and you'll see what that's all about very soon. Okay, are there any questions about what I've talked about so far?
You have got a couple of questions, Mick.
Go ahead.
You've been asked about, would you change your palette of colours if you were weathering a pale coloured livery like improved engine green?
That's a good question. Who thought that one up?
Eric Gates gets the medal.
Well done, Eric. Yes. But what I would say is that when you start down the weathering route, you make a decision about the palette of colours you want to use and stick with it. So it was a very guarded yes, Eric. The reason I put it that way is that if you start using a different set of colours for everything you weather, when you stand back and look at the whole thing, it won't look integrated. It will be a little bit disjointed if something that you look at can be disjointed. What I'd recommend is that once you choose a palette of colours to make things look dirty with, then you should stick with it for the whole of your modelled area, buildings and so on.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Mick, are we using enamel paints, those rail match colours, someone's asked?
Yes, they are. They're rail match enamels. The reason
I thought they were.
The reason I use enamels is because my preferred method of working is with a material that I have got plenty of time to work with. It's not just about putting the paint on, it's about manipulating the paint afterwards as well. And we'll see, if I remember, how that all works in due course. Okay, I'm going to make a start then. Now, while I'm working on the underframe, the spray booth will be going because I'll be using the airbrush. It will make a lot of noise. I'm hoping that the sound of my voice will successfully drown out the sound of the spray booth. We've done a little test, and it did during the test, but that of course does not mean it's going to be like that here. And it also means that while I am using the airbrush, the noise will prevent me from hearing what's going on from my laptop's loudspeaker. So you might be telling me to do something and I'm ignoring you. Well, that's going to be because I haven't heard you. Okay, the airbrush I'm going to use is this one. It's an Iwata HP SB Plus. I like an airbrush with the paint cup that fits into the side. That's a personal preference. One of the reasons I like that is because when it's in place, the angle can be changed. The paint cup is an interference step in the body, and if I want to alter the angle that I'm using the air, I just do that. Of course, I then have to remember that it's at an angle when I put the airbrush into that position. There we go. My preference is to use the paint cup itself for mixing the colours. Now that's because when I'm weathering, I only ever use small amounts at a time. I'm using enamel paints. The first thing, whether you're using enamel or acrylic paints that you put into the airbrush cup is the thinner. You don't use paints like this straight from the jar. They have to be thinned before you spray them through the airbrush or it will block. So my process involves putting thinners into the paint cup first, and then taking the paint from the jar and adding it to that. And I should be taking a paintbrush full of paint and adding it to the thinners I put in the cup. And I know from having done this a few times that the proportion I'm using here is about right for the task I have in front of me. Now I will risk putting this at an angle so you can see what I've got in my paint cup. Excuse me while I just prepare a piece of paper towel to put things on. So there, hopefully you can see the paint I've got in the cup and its consistency. That consistency is about right for the job I've got in hand, which is to put a faint coat onto the underframe of this locomotive. So put my cup into the airbrush. And this is the point at which I have to turn on the spray booth. So prepare yourselves for lots of noise. Hopefully now I've started talking, the sound from my voice is stronger than the spray booth noise. The way this works is to only apply thin coats at a time. And when I say thin coats, I mean a coat that is only just visible. Now, while I'm doing this, you may not see any difference appearing on this black underframe. But what I will do is pause every so often and show you the difference that it has made. The way I do it is by starting off one end, applying the paint across the length of the model and not stopping spraying until I get to the other end. something like this. Now, having done that, what's happened is there are areas where the paint hasn't reached, but behind the connection rod, there's a paint-free, and in order to get rid of that, the battery is used to turn the wheels through a quarter of a turn. Are you able to see now the areas where there is no paint because they were behind the connecting rods? The next stage in the process then is to give another coat in the same manner. And that process now continues until the whole of that side is now discoloured. The tender wheels, which weren't moved obviously by the battery, can be painted quite simply by using the flow of air from the airbrush to turn them. And while they're turning, you apply the paint. So start with air, just air. And once they're turning, apply the paint. And that method works equally well on most rolling stock, as you can probably imagine. Just to show you how much of a difference we've made, if we now turn that round, hopefully you can see the difference between the colour of this side, not yet touched, and the other side, which has had the light coats of paint applied. I've noticed there are one or two areas that haven't been coloured, so I'm just going to add to those. Now, one thing that I didn't do with my airbrush at that angle was the underneath areas of specifically the tender. So a quick waft to rectify that. And we ought not to forget that we need to do the front and rear as well. So while we're here, I'm just going to complete the underframe with coat of the same. There we are. I think now we've got a good enough coat of paint on the underframe, except that I can see some gaps here. So I'll just stop the spray booth for a moment. And I'll change the camera back to one where you can see me. So any questions about what we've done so far? I know it's not very much, but it may have raised a few questions that are burning.
Yeah, there are
issues.
3 questions, Mick.
Yeah.
2 of which are related. Guy Rickson's asked about what pressure area you're using, and Liam Hawkins is talking about flow rate. The enamel is going to be slightly higher pressure than the acrylic, isn't it? Is that correct?
Yes, as a rough guide, if you're using acrylic paint, and this will depend on your airbrush, your compressor, and your fingers, you will probably find you need to use somewhere between 15 and 18 psi for acrylic paints, and between 20 and 25 psi for enamel paints. I give a range because that tends to be the lower and upper end that is useful. The precise pressure you use for any given set of circumstances is going to be discovered by practice, I suggest.
Yeah, and in terms of flow rate, Mick, you're just using very fine finger control on the needle, aren't you?
Yeah, flow rate is not something I give any consideration to at all, because it's something that I watch as the paint comes out of the nozzle. If there's too much, I push my finger forwards, and if there's not enough, I pull my finger back. The airbrush I'm using is a dual action. A dual action means that the trigger, the bit on the top, the trigger performs 2 functions. By pressing it down, you start and maintain the air pressure, and by pulling it back, you change the rate of flow of the paint through the mixture.
And on a related, well, not related topic now, but the 3rd question from David Calderwood: how are you protecting your pickups? I've been in your classes. You just tend to clean up afterwards, don't you?
That's right. I make no effort whatsoever to protect any surface that might be needed to conduct electricity. As Chris suggested, I leave that until the very end. Once I've finished everything and I'm happy that it is all as I want it, that's the point at which I start removing paint. I use isopropyl alcohol and Tamiya shaped cotton swabs for that, because I find that combination will remove even hardened enamel paint from the surfaces where I've put stuff where it shouldn't be.
Right, and there's quite a bit of chat going on about how to clean wheels on DCC locos, but John Gowers has weighed in with some useful advice, and other suggestions are flying backwards and forwards on the chat.
Well, I'll leave you to that then. And what I'll do is I will now continue with the locomotive. Do you think there are any more questions that are burning issues at the moment?
Nothing on chat unless anybody wants to join in now. I think we're good, Mick.
Okay, I'll carry on then. As long as I remember to change the cameras over. So we now have a dirty underframe, if you'll excuse the expression. The next steps really don't need it to be upside down. So pretty much everything from now on is going to be done with a locomotive up this way, although my hand will appear in front of it from time to time. Can you? Yes, you can. You should be able to see that the underframe is now a significantly different colour to the sides of the locomotive. Now I have a little bit of paint left in the airbrush, so what I'm going to do is to use it up by pointing the airbrush downwards at the top of the detail on the tender. You can probably see that that's not quite as discoloured as the rest because of the angle I had to hold the airbrush at the time. So I'm just going to put the spray booth on again and do those upper surfaces. Well, now that's, I think that's as far as we need to go with the underframe. Well, the next step then is to airbrush the sides of the locomotive. Now, I said at the beginning I was using two colours. I was using frame dirt and roof dirt. And the idea being that the top of the locomotive is roof dirt coloured, surprisingly, and the underframe is frame dirt coloured. The bit in the middle would be a mixture of the two. So the next step then is to mix up another batch of paint in the colour cup, starting with thinners. Always start with thinners. And then add to that the frame dirt colour. If you're mixing two colours of a different, well, if you're mixing two different colours, or more in fact, you should always start with the lightest colour. The reason for that is it is much easier to make the contents of the cup darker than it is to start off with it dark and make it lighter. So that is all to do with the density of the pigment, I think. I'm not technical on these things. That's just how I was taught to do it, and I've always done it that way since. That is only frame dirt. What I'm going to do now is to add the quantity of roof dirt to that mixture. Now I need to put the lid back on the pot. If your elbows are as large as mine, you should always have lids on your pots. And the contents mixed together. I know that the ratio I have used of thinners to paint in here is going to provide a thin coat for me when I come to apply it. Something I didn't mention but probably should have done is maybe you saw that there was less than half a cup mixed the underframe, and it lasted for the whole of the underframe, which is what I meant really when I said we only use small quantities. I just need to get rid of the excess around that cup. Now I've put the cup on the airbrush. What I must remember is that the last colour I was using will still exist in this part of the airbrush. But although I've mixed a new colour in the cup, the original colour still exists between where the cup joins the airflow and the nozzle. So before changing colours, I always get rid of what was there before. And now I'm going to have to start the spray booth again. So just to be sure the right colour comes out, I get rid of the excess on a piece of paper towel. So there you can see the colour that I'm going to apply now is not quite the same as what's on the underframe. Same principle is applied to use the colour down the side of the locomotive, in that the thin coat is applied, starting off the model at one end, working your way along, and not stopping spraying until you reach the other end. Now this time, I want to cover a larger area than I was just covering on the underframe. So the airbrush will be further away from the model, which means possibly you won't be able to see it in the picture. So here we go. And I will straight away turn it and do the other side. And not forgetting the front. around the rear of the tender. Now you should be able to see how much of a difference we have made to what was a plain black superstructure. We haven't made it absolutely filthy. We have just used several thin coats. And I've got some left in the paint cup, so I'm just going to do the inside of the tender. Now I'm looking to see if there are any areas still need some cover. Probably do this some more on top of the splashes on both sides. And I think that will do it for that. So we'll go back to turning off the spray boot. And I'll change the camera over again. Oops, sorry, I kicked the table and it wobbled. Okay, any further questions now before I go on to airbrushing the top of the locomotive?
There's quite a few, Mick. Do you want me to summarise?
If you could, please, Chris, thank you.
Yeah, you're using an oilless compressor from Sparmax, I presume. Am I right?
No, it's the one I use in my workshop is actually an Iwata.
But is it oilless? That's the question.
Yes, yeah, it's an oil-less piston
Right.
compressor. Yeah,
And
so
you've
there's no diaphragm involved.
And you've used the same cup throughout this particular job, haven't you?
Yep.
You haven't changed
Yep.
cups.
Nope.
And your nozzle. How big's your nozzle, Mick?
I beg your pardon?
How big's your nozzle, Mick? Is it a
Airbrush I'm
0.5
using-
or is it finer than that?
The airbrush I'm using is a 0.35mm nozzle.
So it's quite fine.
It is quite fine, and the reason I use it is because it gives me a pretty fair degree of control. I don't know if you saw it, but when I was doing the side of the locomotive, I'd not bothered masking the underframe off at all. That's because I was confident that the accuracy with this airbrush would restrict my overspray from going where I didn't want it to be.
And talking about things not going where you don't want, somebody said you wear a mask, and I've said it depends on you. If your ventilator's good, that's fine, and you use a bench vent.
I because of what I do, I have a fairly powerful spray boot. So I'm fairly confident that the noise you can hear is removing all of the spray from my face. So I don't normally use a mask because I'm confident in the performance of my spray boot. There are a lot perfectly serviceable but cheap on the market, which make a lot of noise, but they don't actually remove all the nasty stuff from your face. If you are just wanting to start off in the hobby and not quite sure what it is you want to end up doing, if you're using a cheap spray booth, I strongly recommend the use of a face mask as well. Of course, if you are unfortunate and suffer from a respiratory problem, you may want to use an appropriate mask regardless of your spray booth.
Right. You don't mask the glass in the windows on the loco, do you? You clean up afterwards.
Well, my approach is, if you're going to make something dirty, the chances are the whole of it will be the same level of dirt. However, if you've got spectacle glasses in a locomotive, for example, the footplate crew might well have done something about making them clean. So in that case, if I decide that's what I want, then I will clean the paint off spectacle plates of locomotives after I've finished. Coaches, if you apply that principle to coach about it, for the most part, unless you're going back really a long way in time, people were not employed cleaning windows in coaches. Yes, they did used to do it at one point in time, but not all. It stopped. I can't remember when. I'd have to look it up. But the principle is that the whole of the side of the coach weathers at the same rate. If it goes through a carriage washing plant, then the whole of the side will be clean, including the windows. If it doesn't go through a carriage washing plant, then the dirt on the sides will be the same level of dirt on the windows. That's my approach. Not everybody would agree with that, obviously.
Right, there are quite a few of them on there. Somebody's asked how long you leave the airbrush between colours when you're cleaning.
I'm using an enamel paint which is quite thin, so there's a high proportion of thinners, which means I can quite comfortably leave it while I'm talking to you, for example, without worrying about paint drying inside the airbrush itself. If I was using acrylic paints, it would be a different matter. Acrylic paint dries very quickly, so that might well already in this short time I've been talking would have started drying inside the airbrush. My approach to everything when I'm using acrylic paints is slightly different to enamels. Everything has to be done quicker with acrylics, and if you stop using it for even 5 minutes, then I flush it through with clean thinners before I put it down.
And one final question that I can see on the chat: if you want a different texture to the smoke box, i.e. more matte, would you brush paint this area before applying the dirt mixture? My
answer to that is have patience.
There we go. And I think
Okay.
we've covered the question from Torbin on acrylics. If Torbin's happy with that, I think we're there, Mick.
Okay, right. Back to the camera then. The last use of the airbrush is going to be to work on the upper surfaces, the top of the boiler, the cab roof, and the top of the tender, and so on. So for the final time, we mix up the paint thinners first. And then a brushful of frame dirt. Well, not a full brushful this time because we don't want it to be, well, we want it to be darker, so the proportion of roof dirt needs to be greater. I haven't gone into much detail about consistency, so this might be an appropriate point to talk about that. The consistency, the ideal consistency for use in an airbrush is something like milk. And I guess some people are thinking to themselves, what does he mean by milk? Does he mean full cream or semi-skimmed? The answer to that is it's got nothing to do with the type of milk. It's to do with the consistency of the content. And it means that when you tip the paint cup up and you can see the inside, if you wiggle it about a bit, if the paint around the side as a result of that goes straight back down into the body of the cup, it's too thin. If it sticks to the side and doesn't move, it's too thick. If, and this is not quite right because I've still got some paint to add, but maybe you can see that the paint on the side is going quite quickly back down into the cup. But when I've added my roof dirt, one brushful at a time, maybe you can see from where I'm running the brush against the edge of the cup that it's no longer running straight back down. It's taking a little bit of time to run back down into the cup. That is the sort of consistency we're looking for. So it doesn't run straight back down immediately. some of it sticks, but on the other hand, it doesn't just stay put on the side of the cup. If that's not clear, then I can come back to that and explain it a bit better later on. So that now gives me the colour I want to use for my roof. Can you see that? Okay, so you probably can. Back to the cup in the airbrush. Now this time I'm going to be applying from a different angle because I want this to cover the top surface of the model. So I have to change the angle. So instead of holding it this angle, I'm going to use the ability to alter the cup and spray from something like that. So the angle of my airbrush is increased, but of course the cup still stays vertical. So now we go back to the noisy bit. No difference in the approach. I'm still going to spray thin coats, starting at one end and working my way along. Not forgetting, of course, that I've got the wrong colour in the airbrush to start with. So here we go. Not forgetting, of course, that I need to do the front of the chimney, the dome, and the cap. And the smoke box. And the rear of them as well. You can possibly see that all that beautiful detail inside the cab is quite bright and colourful. And when the thing's in use, that would not necessarily be the case. So while I've got this colour of paint in the cup, I can just use some of that to tone it down a bit, just slightly. So there we are. That's toned it down a bit, but hasn't hidden it completely. So once more, along the top, on both sides. Rear of the fender. On the front as well. Hopefully you can see now that we have a nice colour of dusty dirt all over the locomotive. One thing that still stands out a bit is the totem and the cabside number. So from a fair distance, beyond the camera's view, I'm just going to add a little more to tone that down slightly. As far as I can see, I've now given the whole thing a coat of dry. Not absolutely filthy, that just happens to be the way I like to do my weathering. Right, I'm now happy that I've got rid of the black. So there is no longer any clean, untouched black on that locomotive. It has a coating of grime all over it. There we are. So I'm going to waffle on for a little bit now because I want to give some of that paint at least the opportunity to dry. Now enamel paint takes quite a long time to dry hard, But because we've only used thin coats, that phrase again, thin coats, not very much. Because we've only used thin coats, it doesn't take very long to dry. And when I say dry, I mean dry enough for us to work on it subsequently. The rest of the work I'm going to do on this is going to be with what I call pigments, or other people call it weathering powders. Doesn't really matter what it's called, it's the same thing. It's finely ground pigment that is used to add areas of discoloration to whatever the subject is you're working on. My approach is much the same with pigments as it is with paints, and that is to use not very much. The idea being that, once again, it's easy to add more if you haven't got it right than it is to take it off. Now, there are several pigment manufacturers that I recommend. And the reason I recommend them is that I have found they work for me. There are a lot of weathering powders on the market. Some are suitable for this sort of work, others are not. And the reason I put it that way is it's personal choice. I use the ones that I recommend. I recommend the ones that I use for a reason, and that's because they work for me. They might not work for other people. The ones I am using today are ones that I've had for a very long time, and there is still a lot left in the containers. So you shouldn't need to buy very many, well, more than one, I'd say, pot of the same colour, and try and avoid collecting. Oh, that's difficult for railway modelers to do. But you only need a selection of a few colours. You saw at the beginning the colours that I'm going to be using, and it's those four, or a combination of those four, that I use throughout my weathering. But I do have a lot because I didn't follow my own advice in the beginning, and I did some collecting. I found a pale, almost grey brown colour, which is underframe dirt. A darker brown colour to represent old rust and areas of ground in grime. An almost black, but not quite, a dark grey to almost black, and that's used for the smoke box and the cab roof. And here we go back to the texture question that was asked earlier on. That's how I add texture to the smoke box. And a paler colour to represent ash and areas on the top of coach footboards and things like that. So in the main, I only use 4 different colours. The precise nature of those colours varies depending on what mood I'm in often, and who I might be weathering for. For my own weathering purposes, I use the 4 colours I showed at the beginning. Containers I have had since I first done this. I forget how long ago that is now. It's probably getting close to 10 years. And I'm still using the same containers. There is still enough pigment in those to allow me to continue using them. They are by Mick Productions. Mick Productions are no longer in production. He ceased trading under that name a long time ago. But the same range of colours is now available from a company called Abteilung 502. I think maybe what I'll do at the end of this is produce a list of the materials that you see me using, so that you can refer to it should you so wish. Okay. Any more questions about airbrushing? Because I'm not going to use the airbrush anymore.
Right, Mick, we had a few. Quentin asked earlier on, and we didn't answer it earlier, apologies. I noticed you sprayed downwards rather than perpendicular to the surface. Is that because you view the main surface from an angle above the loco?
No, the main reason for that is the connector I've got on the airbrush won't allow me to use it at any other angle. What I tend to do, if I actually want it to be at right angles to the surface is I tilt the model. What I use is these. These are chopstick rests. And I find if I place those on the surface of my turntable, I can rest the model against them, and the only places where the model touches anything is these two places here.
Right.
Does that answer that question, Quentin? Okay. Any
Right.
more?
Okay. Can I just confirm, Mick, you're just using white spirit for thinning your enamels, aren't you?
I only ever use white spirit. You could spend a lot of money and buy the paint manufacturers own the thinners, but they tend often to contain something else which smells, gives you a headache, and costs too much. So white spirit is what I use for all enamel paints.
Okay.
And it
And
works.
talking of smells and headaches, someone asked, is there a difference in the ventilator requirements for acrylics and enamels? Now, there is a slight difference, but it's not massive, is it?
No, it's not the smell, it's the paint particles that you want to get rid of. Yes, the smell that comes with white spirit and solvents and enamels is not nice, but that's not what you're trying to get rid of. It's the particles of paint. An airbrush works by atomizing the paint in the cup. So it doesn't matter whether it's acrylic, enamel, or what. That's what you don't want to be inhaling, the paint particles.
Okay, and finally, there was a question about pigment colours, but I suspect you're going to go through that again now. Someone said, what was the fourth pigment colour? I believe it was the lightest. Was it dust?
That's someone who just wasn't paying attention at the beginning, isn't it?
I couldn't possibly comment, and it's not me this time.
The four colours I'm using, the names of the colours I'm using are dark mud, black brown, smoke black, or black smoke, one or the other, and rubble dust. But it's not the names that are important, it's the colours. So we're using a mid-brown, a dark brown, an almost black, and a pale beigey grey colour.
Well, that's sufficiently technical for all of us, Mick, so thank you. I can't see any more on the feed, so over to you.
Okay then, back to the other camera.
Before you go, Mick, can I just say one thing? One you haven't mentioned, and going back to that spraying at perpendicular or going at angles, is to think when you're putting the paint on how the weathering appeared in the first place. So if you're doing underframe, a lot of the dirt and everything is coming from the bottom upwards, whereas on the body and everything with the actual weather effects is coming from the top downwards.
Yes, very true. Yeah. Yes, the dark colours are spreading down from the top, and the browny colours are spreading upwards from the bottom. Yeah.
So if you consider the way in which the dirt got onto a locomotive from the weathering point of view in the first place, you can mimic that with the airbrush or your paintbrush. Yes,
that applies to all aspects of weathering. You need to have an understanding of why it's there and how it got there. So don't just throw dirt and different colours at something. You need to understand what the colours are that you're applying and why you're applying them and where. The best way is either to have a brilliant memory and you know absolutely everything about why stuff is, or you rely on photographs.
Thanks, Mick.
Thank you, David.
Mick.
Any more questions?
Mick, we have one more. Andrew Glover. Confused by your nozzle size. He says the iWater HPSB Plus normally has a 0.2 and you're asked if you'd fitted the 0.35 to that separately.
Andrew could be right. Thank you, Andy. Yeah, maybe it is a 0.2, but I thought that was a custom micron. Don't know.
Oh, well.
Look at that on iWater's website.
Okay.
I just happen to use this one because it suits me. Okay.
But you haven't changed the thing. You haven't changed the nozzle or the needle.
No. This is what I'm using. Is how it was supplied.
Fine. Thanks, Mick. That's it.
Okay. Sorry, did someone say something? Right. I'm not going to need to use the spray booth anymore. So everything else now is down to pigments or weathering powders. So I'm just going to change camera again. This may well be not quite as easy for people to see as what I've done before, because the level of light I have to illuminate things might fade the pigments, the pigment colours too much. However, I'm going to proceed anyway. Probably the easiest place for me to start to show how pigments are used is to use them on the surface of the running plate. Now, on the real thing, I'm led to believe, and I don't know this because I was not interested in railways at the time it was happening, but the photographs I've seen and the stories I've heard all say that the horizontal surfaces of a running plate were covered in ash and all sorts of other dirt to prevent them being slippery. I've got no reason to argue with that. So I'm going to start by applying some pigment to the area underneath the smoke box door. I don't take pigment from the jar. What I do is take it from the lid. The level of light makes this a bit difficult for me to show you, but there is always a pigment sticking to the inside of the lid of one of these jars, and that's where I get the pigment from that I'm going to apply to them all. Once again, I don't use very much, so can you see that there isn't very much pigment on that brush? I use a filbert brush for this, and the reason I use a filbert brush is because it has soft but nonetheless fairly firm bristles. We like soft but firm, don't we? And it's applied by just dabbing the area you want it to stick. I didn't start off with very much, but what I am doing is spreading out what I've applied quite a long way. So I think you can, I think you can see the area of discoloration that I've produced by applying a very tiny amount. Continues in other places. I suppose the next area that would be affected by this is around clumsy. I've not got a very large area to work in here. Around sandbox filler caps. Yes, you can see that. Turn it around to do the same on the other side. And also the horizontal surfaces of steps tend to be discoloured slightly as well. At the moment, this looks horrendous with a big contrast. But that's catered for in a moment. Now I've got some material left on the brush, so I'm just going to apply it randomly to other areas of the running plate. The idea behind this really is just break up that beautifully distributed monotonous colour that we put on with the air. these things aren't like that in real life. Okay. Yes, you can see those areas of discoloration, I think. So we've broken up that a bit. The next colour I'm going to work with is dark mud. And as you can see, it's a gingery brown colour. And this is the sort of colour that appeared on underframes. And this is going to be used around the tender area. And what I'm going to do here is to use my chopstick rests to tilt it at an angle. Now this lid has been used so often that it's come apart from its top, but I'm still going to take the pigment from the lid and not dip it into the top. And this is just simply added to areas of the tender to start with. No reason why I'm starting with the tender other than that's what I changed it. I'm not being too picky about where it goes or doesn't go. I'm just simply adding that tractor colour to vary what was put on there. Working on frames, other areas. This tractor arrives. Same on the other side. I'm hoping you can see this. I'm just intent on putting it on. I should be watching the screen at the same time. That was put on with the airbrush. If you look at any photograph of a steam engine that's been working, it's not one colour, it's not all one colour. We're just using this to change the appearance of some parts. I'll try and put it so the light catches it properly. Hopefully you can see that there's a change in the appearance of the underparts where the pigment's been applied. Another area that would be coloured is the inside of the tender. I'm going to use my other brown colour to begin with here. And this is a darker brown. It has a slight red tinge to it. Rather too much in the middle of this. And I'm going to use this colour to represent the old rust as it would appear in the seams and corners and edges of an area like the inside of a tender. I'll start in the corners with this colour. And from there, spread it. This particular model comes with a large lump of metal that has the coal shape and texture moulded into it. The purposes of this exercise, I have just simply removed it and put it on one side. Most of the weathering I do includes adding real coal, and that's what would happen to this locomotive as well. So some of this that I'm doing now would actually end up not being visible, but it's a step in the process that I take. Excuse me. Now, hopefully you can see, yes you can, that there is some apparently rusty bits that have accumulated inside the tender. Now, it wouldn't all be one colour. Old rust is a different colour to new rust. And in order to show that difference, I'm now going to use some more of the dark mud to represent newer rust. Not new necessarily, but newer. It's probably not easy for you to see the difference in colour here. As I progress, you may see that difference appearing. Once again, the main reason for this is not to have one single colour, but to maintain that distribution of different types of dirt over the area. I know how things were when I took the coal out, that this space I'm working on now would not be covered by the coal zone. I've got it somewhere. I'll do, yeah. We'll put the supplied coal load in place and you can see what we've achieved by doing that. There we are. So that's the tender having had a little bit of rust applied with the coal load put back in. Right, I'm starting to get a bit croaky. So what I'll do is give my voice a rest sort of and see if there are any more questions at this stage.
A couple of questions, Mick. I think I know what the first answer is. Do you use anything to seal your pigments when you've finished?
Nope.
No, I didn't think you did. Another question here. Is there any advantage in applying the pigments straight after the airbrush weathering? Would you get the same result in a week rather than just after an hour?
As I explained earlier on, we can work this close after applying the enamel paint because we've only put on a thin coat and it is dry enough to apply pigments. You could leave it a day, a week, a month, and you'd still get the same result.
And the Mick pigments, is the company now Abteilung 502, 402, something like that?
Abteilung 502, ABTEILUNG 502.
Well, that was the question so far, unless we can invite any more while you pause.
Any more questions while you've got the chance?
Can I ask if have you had any problems with any particular weathering powders, or ones you'd avoid, or if you'd rather not name them? Fair enough.
I'm quite happy to name them, as I have said. Let me not lean on the table so I don't wobble too much. I use what I recommend, and I recommend what I use. I have not had the results I would like to have had with the original Cars weathering powders, with Humbrol weathering powders, with DCC Concept weathering powders, and with some of the ones that are aimed at military modelling no, I was going to say at the cheap end of the market. That wouldn't be right or fair. And the reason for that is, for my purposes, and this is a personal opinion, for my purposes, those pigments aren't finely enough ground.
Right. Okay.
If I chose to use, for example, Humbrol weathering powders on this subject, I would not get the result I wanted, because they are rather coarse. Rather coarse.
Right. Okay.
Is that Rich?
That was Liam.
That was
Hopkins.
Liam.
That was
Okay,
Liam.
sounded-
Sorry,
Yeah.
Cameron. Thank you.
And Mick, we've got a follow-up on the sealing. Quentin said, don't the pigments come off the loco if you don't seal them? And we've had quite a few people have asked the same question. I presume the fine pigments you use are taking to the surface.
Yes, let me. I'll explain that a bit more. Yes, I did mention just now that they're finely ground, and that is why I don't have trouble with them coming off. I apply these pigments to matte surfaces. If you look, for example, at a gloss surface under a microscope, the gloss surface looks like that. It's very flat, which is why it looks glossy, because the light doesn't reflect, because the light reflects on it. However, if you look at a matte surface under a microscope under the same conditions, it looks like that. So there are troughs in the surface. Microscopic maybe, but there are troughs that are there. And these pigments that I favour are so finely ground that the particles fall into those troughs. So when you rub your finger across the top, you don't remove those particles that your finger can't reach. So they stay put. That's why, Julian, I see, don't they drop off or wear out? No, they don't wear out. Once they're in that trough, they stay put. You can't get rid of them. So that does mean that you have to be a little more careful when you apply pigments, because if you put them in the wrong place, they're not easy to remove.
I mean,
yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, there are some people who use the Humbrols and seal them and do it quite successfully, but it's a different approach, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a different approach, and it works for them.
Yeah.
I prefer, having put on different shades of paint and different textures with the pigments, to have that remain. If I then cover it with a varnish or something else, for a start, some of those colours tend to merge into each other, and I lose the effect of different textures that I've just spent so long applying.
And there was a final question: is would you cover the coal with a smoke black pigment, or in fact, would you possibly use real coal?
What I do is raid my neighbour's coal scuttle and take the odd lump of coal out and break it up and use real coal. Real coal is one of the few things that does scale down.
Yeah.
If I wanted to work with this moulded metal coal, I would probably apply a black wash to it and then give it a coat of Tesla's Dull Coat, and before that's dry, give it a wipe over. Giving it a wipe over will get rid of the flat effect on the surfaces, but leave it in the hollows between the artificial pieces of coal.
Fine. And finally, Chris Tooth has posted up on the chat the link for the Absalon 502 powders, so that's up there on the chat for everybody.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you, Chris, for that.
Yeah. That no one's typing, so I think we've covered that one off, Mick.
Okay, in that case, having not given my voice a rest, I'll turn back to the other camera. One of the questions earlier on, I think, was talking about texture on smokebox. And this is the point at which I hopefully will be answering that very question. At the beginning, when I gave the list of colours I was going to use, one of them was Mick Black Smoke, or Abteilung 502 Black Smoke. Once again, this is one that's been in use for a long time, so the lid was fallen off the pot. I use this to introduce that different texture that exists around the smoke box and the cab roof, and possibly also areas within the tender where coal dust remains. Once again, taking the powder from the lid, because I want the finest of particles, and that's where they tend to congregate. I just then apply to the chimney and the smoke box. If I can position it where you can see it better. Can't see this very well. I'm just going to move this camera, I think. Let's hope we'll get better. Yes, you can now see that the texture of this area is changing as I apply this powder. And because this is not actually pure black, you can see it has quite a warm discoloration. Turn the motor around so I can go the other side. Maybe you can see that I'm not actually trying to be perfect with this. What I'm doing is introducing these variations in tone to areas they will exist on the real thing, according to the photographs. I do the same to the cab roof, and I apply this colour. In this case, I'm manipulating the powder in the direction that gravity would normally take it. So the dirt would land on the roof, and then when it rained, it would be carried towards the edges by gravity and water. Yeah, I think you can I move it back. And you now see the difference in colour and texture between the smoke box, the cab roof, and the rest of the boiler. Now, this colour can also be plonked, to use a technical term, in various random areas on the running plate to continue that process of discoloration that I talked about earlier. And some photographs you see of steam locomotives show that the wheels have a lot. And one way you can represent that oil on locomotives like this is to apply this same dark colour to the wheel centres. And maybe, as in the case of the C-class, a lot of photographs I've seen of this locomotive show that this rear set of drivers seems to have a lot more oil on it than the other two. And also, there is some darker colouring on the areas around joints. Presumably that also comes from oil. I'm not going to do it, but at this point I would turn the wheels a bit so that I can get to those areas, those folks up here that are currently underneath the line. Something else that would probably be oily and therefore a slightly different colour of dirt would be tender axle boxes, for example. Once again, deliberately not using large quantities of this stuff, just adding slight discoloration. And I'll put it where you can see that better. Yes, maybe now you can see that these areas of these axle boxes are a different colour to the frames of the tender, for example. And there might be some coal dust, some residual coal dust in areas of the tender top. Okay. What I'll do now then is just slowly turn the turntable in the hope that you get a better view of the differences that we've made to this locomotive in the few steps we've used to present some discoloration. You see how areas of the running plate a bit different to the rest of it. Okay, something else that you can use a dark coloured pigment for, to my eye, and this might not be the same as yours, but to my eye, that cab side number still stands out rather a lot. So with what pigment there is left on the brush, I'm not adding more, I'm using what's left there. I could take it back even further. Can you see the difference between the 312 and the 27? That's been achieved by rubbing what's left over the surface. And this also has the added advantage that it's changed that flat, even look of the paint on the side of the cab. Can you see that? Yes, Mick. The same with the totem, I think. Probably achieve the same. Yep, there is enough left on there. And I'm also going to rough up this flat, even surface on the side of the tender. There, I don't plan to do any more on this. That is significantly different to what we started with. Okay. I'll come back to the main screen now. So there we have it. What further questions have we got, folks? Any?
Well, first of all, I had a private message from John Richardson who said that if you're looking at windows, it's a very good case for looking at photographs, because depending on how important the stock is, you might find they're cleaned less frequently in suburban use rather than top link use. So good point there from John.
Yeah, absolutely right, John.
We've had a couple of people who've had to leave but passed on a lot of thanks, which is very nice. Someone asked earlier on if the texture of the pigments is a bit like cosmetic things. You haven't gone into the world of pan pastels, but I assume we're in that sort of territory with cosmetics, are we?
I don't use cosmetics myself, so I'm not in a position to answer that, really.
That's the right answer.
I suspect that we're talking about something fairly similar in that, as far as I understand it, cosmetic textures are quite fine because they've got to lodge themselves into the pores of the skin, haven't they?
They have. Yeah, there's a question about pre-grouping locos and getting clear references. Would it be with similar colouring and staining, but probably things a bit better cleaned and more shiny in pre-grouping times?
I would suggest that what people who model pre-grouping stuff, well, anything before the 1950s, so 1950 and earlier, it's going to be very difficult to find usable colour photographs. The colour of dirt, nonetheless, that falls on top of stuff is exactly the same. There is no difference in the colour of dirt that falls on a 1950s locomotive, but that would have fallen on a 1920 one. The source of the dirt is exactly the same. Black stuff coming out of the front and brown stuff coming up from the track. If you are unable to find a colour photograph of your chosen subject during the time period you want to model, then the way I cope with that is I have the black and white photograph that I have been able to find beside me, and I find a photograph of a similar locomotive or piece of rolling stock in colour. It obviously won't be from the same period, but it will have the dirt in the same places because the dirt will form and fall in the same places as it did 30 years before. If you then turn your colour photograph into a black and white one using whatever technology you've got available, your smartphone or a piece of software, you can then see how the different tones agree with each other or disagree with each other between the two photographs. It's not foolproof, but it does give you a fairly good idea of how you can work colours into a model from a black and white photograph.
Okay, a couple of questions about pigments now. In passing though, someone asked a question about fading cab numbers, which you did almost as soon as it came in using the pigments. But then someone said, and someone else came in with a very similar question, if you put too much pigment on, how can you get it off?
You can't.
That's what I thought the answer was, but I didn't like to say.
which is why really I'm going back to saying small quantities at a time. That's not quite true. If you put too much on, the surface you're putting it onto will only take so much. You may find that you can get rid of some of the real excess by rubbing it with a paper towel or a cotton swab, but you won't be able to get it all off.
You could simulate a cleaned number though, presumably with a bit of IPA.
You could, yeah, yes.
Yeah.
The pigment I put onto that cabside number could be taken off by judicious rubbing with a cotton bud, for example. You wouldn't get it all off, but you'd certainly get some of it off.
Okay. Rob Thompson says, would you use washes on this model as well, presumably if you had a lot more time?
If I had a lot more time, yes, I would have been applying washes as well. Yeah. Yeah. So,
question from Rodney Hall. If you want to paint a black from bare metal, would you start with a pure black? Well, that's down to personal choice. That's a different topic to weathering, really.
if you started off with, when you say a bare model, do you mean it's already been painted or it's bare metal?
Where's Rodney? Does he want to join in and press his space bar and clarify? I've asked Rodney to unmute, but I'm not getting a response at this point. There we are. He should be speaking.
So say a Kilbert loco in brass. So you're not starting with a painted RTR loco.
If I was starting from there, paint it normally. If it's brass, then it will probably need a coat of primer. It would definitely need primer if it's going to be handled at all. And once the primer is dry, you apply your top coat or coats, however you want it to finish. And then once all that is finished, hard and dry, probably give it a week, then I'd start the weathering process.
Right, question from Peter Stanton. Talking about the last days of BR steam locos, they were cleaned with paraffin cloths. How would you simulate that, Mick?
What I would do, I've not seen any photographs where that stands out, certainly not in 4mm scale. You might be able to achieve it in 7mm and above. The way I would approach it though would be to use a Tamiya shaped cotton swab. You can get them with either a triangular point or a round point. The large ones with a rounded end can be used if you twirl them against the surface. So if that's the surface of the model, I would twirl it like that, and that would give you circular impressions in the weathering. Yes, you could probably see that effect in some photographs. I myself would be a bit wary about trying to reproduce that in 4mm and below. 7mm and above, fine.
Okay, and there is a question about cleaning airbrushes. I think there's something on the website about cleaning airbrushes. Have you done something on the website? Is there a PDF?
Yes,
on?
there's a PDF article on the website about cleaning airbrushes.
I mean, the question is, yes, you do strip it down to clean it properly, don't you?
Oh yes, yeah. As soon as I've finished this, I'll be taking it to Forge.
Right, and in fact, Simon's posted the link there for everybody. Thanks, Simon.
Well done, Simon. Thank you very much.
God, he was ahead of us. I thought there was something. That's the questions we have, and I suppose it's open season if anybody wants to stick their hand up and join in now.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Any further questions, please feel free to ask.
Mick,
Yes, Rob.
on the cab sides of locomotives, you often see them where the cabs sides are very dirty, but the number, there's been an attempt by the crew to clean the number up. How would you simulate that if you've gone over the whole of the cab side with your dirty smoke or whatever?
The process is fairly straightforward with enamels. They stay wet underneath the top surface for quite some time, 24, 48 hours. So before it's dried hard, I use a cotton swab and just gently rub it against the numbers until enough comes off to represent the look I want.
Okay, fine. Yeah.
You have to be careful not to overdo it though.
Yeah, thanks very much. Okay, fine.
Any other questions? Have I really answered all of those questions without them being asked?
Yes, you seem to have done, Mick.
Can I have a quick question? Is there time for a quick question? Yeah, you mentioned washes.
There's plenty of time, yeah.
What would you recommend for washes, or what sort of approach would you take if you had a bit more time, you said?
Washes are applied, I'll start that again. I apply washes with a brush called a rigger, R-I-G-G-E-R. Let me see if I've got one available. Yes, I have. That's a rigger. Hopefully you can see that it has long bristles. They're quite long. And when you get it wet, I'm just going to dip it in some thinners here. That splayed out end actually becomes quite thin. All I've done is drip that into white spirit. So you can see that there's a fairly good length of bristle, but it's got a fine point, and that enables you to have a decent amount of wash, but be quite specific about where you position it.
Right.
Yeah. And although a wash is a thin paint, I always thin it even further with white spirit before I start applying it. So I have my jar of wash available there and my dish of thinners there, and the brush is dipped in the thinners first and then into the wash. So I'm picking up an even thinner fluid than is provided in the jar. And carry on.
I was going to say, what stage in the process would you apply a wash? Presumably, if you put them on after the pigments, it would ruin the pigments, would it?
Well, not only that, it will go everywhere.
Yes.
The principle behind using a wash is to make use of capillary action to get it to spread into nooks and crannies and corners, and that works best on a factory finish or a gloss finish. So the sequence I follow, that doesn't mean it works for everybody, but the sequence I follow is I start with the wash. That's the very first thing. If I know I want to do something, start with a wash. The next thing then is the paint. So that's followed by the weathering bits I do. And the final thing is the pigments. So wash, paint, pigments is the sequence I follow.
Yeah. I've just put the link there about the Peckett upper bodywork where you used to wash and then pigments, Mick, and I think Mark's answered something about brushes as well. It's all up there.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Someone's asked what size is the rigger brush. I think it's just called a rigger brush, isn't it, Mick? Or do they come in different sizes?
This one is a 4. I use, it depends on how much fluid I want to put on and where I want to put it. I use either a 0, 2 or a 4. Thanks, Mick.
Where would you have started with the wash on this particular loco you've demonstrated, if at all?
Yeah, on this locomotive, being black and wanting it to continue to look black, I probably would not have used the wash at all.
Right, that's what I thought.
However, if I wanted it to look dusty, as some locomotives were because of the environment they worked in, I would have used a pale, dusty coloured wash to add that sort of effect into corners and edges.
Right, okay, fine.
Would you use a wash on valves and bare metal work, Mick, at all?
Depends on the finished product. Yes, probably in 7mm scale and above, yes. Where you want to get detail highlighted, weathering is just as good for highlighting detail as it is for making things dirty. I would use a wash in areas to highlight the detail. Yeah.
Where you've got the lime scale coming down the side of a smoke box or boiler, would you use a wash for that?
No. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I can show you something along those lines. So just bear with me, Rob. I'm going to change the camera again. I'm going to remove the one on the turntable. And here, in true Blue Peter fashion, is one I did earlier. How about that then? You weren't expecting that, were you?
Definitely not.
Can you see on this one, that discoloration down there?
Yes.
From the safety valves. That is something that you quite often see in photographs of C-class locomotives that worked in certain areas, mainly South Downs and southwards. That is achieved on this model quite simply by using rubble dust. So it's pigment that I've used for that. And I start off by applying it at the top of the safety valves and then dragging it downward with the brush. Simple as that. And it's got a great contrast, but hopefully you can see that that looks like line scale that's dribbled down from the safety valves. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks, Mick.
Okay, jolly good. Right, we'll come back so that you can I can see you again. Any more questions then, guys?
Going back
yes,
to
Mick.
all right.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
I have an N-gauge DMU
Yep.
with a almost white roof. It's very light grey, which looks very pristine, but it has lines going across it that I'd like to pick up when I weather it.
Okay. So it's sort of the roof edges of roof covering panels or something like that, is it?
I can, if you can see that, but I can't see my own move. Can you see it?
Right. Just hang on. I need to pick you. Who is talking, please?
Torben.
On you.
If I say something, then you should be able to pick me up.
Yes, but not on the view I'm having to use on my small laptop screen.
Oh, okay.
All right, Torben. Yes, I see you now. Okay.
Can you see the beating question?
Not very well because you've got that that background behind you. But yeah, oh, now I can see it now. Yes. Okay. What do you want your colour to be at the end of the day? So you'll have to unmute yourself, Torben.
He wants to be darker than that anyway, that's for sure.
Well, it does, yes. But do you want an absolutely filthy colour, or do you want it to be slightly used?
No, I think fairly filthy.
Pardon?
Fairly filthy, I think, would suit it.
Okay. In that case, what I would do is on the lines you want to end up standing out a bit, apply a pure black wash. And that will create for you an artificial shadow that should then still stand out when you've applied the end colour.
Yes, but can I just use paints that are thinned a lot?
Yes.
Good, thank you.
Any more questions, folks?
Mick, can you hear me?
Yes, Paul.
Yeah, excellent. With regards to the Martin Welsh weathering, which I'm sure we've all looked at,
yep,
he tends to use a lot of metal coat on shiny surfaces, things which got oil accumulation, axle boxes. Is that something which you use as well in your washes?
Yes, I have used those, but I tend to work in 4mm scale. So if I use that sort of material, sometimes it makes it too stark. It stands out too much.
Okay, so could you apply it to your tender axle boxes, for instance? Prior
Yes, you could.
Your,
yeah. If you want a shiny surface to appear, yes, that's a good way of doing it. Another method I use is metallic pigments. Several of the pigment manufacturers produce things like polished steel or polished aluminium, and they can be quite useful for that sort of thing. Horses for courses, really.
Excellent. All right, thank you.
Okay, Paul. Anybody else then?
Mick, I asked you some time ago on another sort of question that you can get some colours. I mean, if you look at, say, a red car that's been painted, red has that tendency not only to go matte, but sort of to fade to a much paler and almost sort of dusty sort of colour.
Yeah.
When I spoke to you some time ago, I was talking about some of the old farm wagons with that lovely blue and sort of terracotta type colour. Would a wash be the suitable thing to sort of tone that lot down?
Yes, I am guilty of not answering your question from all those weeks ago, David, for which I apologise. Yes, fading can be done in quite a few ways, and using a pale, dusty wash is one way of starting the process, but it won't necessarily be satisfactory in achieving that overall discoloration. You saw me using rubble dust pigment on the safety valves on the C-Class, for example. That is a way of introducing a lifting effect, but don't use stark white. It needs to have an element of grey or cream in it. That's one way of doing it. Another way would be to use a very, very thin wash of a pale creamy colour over the top of the blue or red. But obviously that would have to be a very thin coat, so it had that dusty finish to it.
Washes don't finish with a sort of glossy finish, glossy.
Some washes will end up glossy, others will end up matte. And I don't know from the top of my head which ones are which. What I would suggest is that you don't worry about that until you have finished, and then put a layer of matte varnish over the top of the whole thing. Matte varnish, or something like the rubble dust powders. Those would go matte as well, wouldn't they? Oh, yes, of course they would be shiny. Of course, the powders aren't going to get in. Sorry, if it's a shiny one, of course, the powder won't attach to it. That's very true. That's very true. Yeah. Yeah, it's actually, you were just reminding me as well when you were saying don't use white to do the bits and pieces, using off-white. Was that thing of if you're letting a colour down or whatever, is not, rather than doing it with white, doing it with something like a flesh colour, a pale flesh or something. Yes, indeed. Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Mick. Any more questions, folks?
Nothing more on the chat, Mick. Lots of thanks. People are very grateful to you.
Well, I've enjoyed it. It made me stop and think about what I was doing rather than just ploughing on through it. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Well, I don't think I've got anything to add from what I've done already. I've shown you what I consider to be the basic steps in weathering. Weathering is in fashion at the moment, so there's a lot of things, there's a lot of interest in the topic. And what you have seen me do is only really a very small part of what can be done, both in terms of processes, techniques, and tools.
One more question, Mick, just flooded in before the close. Best finish for weathering, a matte finish? I mean, to
I would suggest that if you're, sorry, last bit.
Yeah, what is the best finish to start with when you start weathering? A flat finish? I've seen you dull coat things before you start weathering them.
Oh, yeah, you need to have at the very least a satin finish, preferably matte. Nothing will work on a gloss finish, nothing at all. Well, sorry, in terms of pigments, nothing will work on a gloss surface. So I always start with an absolute minimum of a satin finish.
Fine. That was just a question that flooded in at the end. There you are.
Right. Yeah. Is everybody exhausted like me?
Just start
Mick,
it.
can I just, Mick, can I just ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Following on from that not gloss point. What if you're trying to weather very light weathering of a sort of top shed at an eastern region Pacific, which is sort of basically been shined up, but has got a day's weathering over it. So just on the top, I would expect to start with a gloss finish and just apply a bit of weathering along the top and around the smoke box. But is there a different way of doing it?
That is probably the easiest way of doing it. There are other approaches, one of which I have used successfully before, and that is to judiciously apply the weathering and then strangely start to take it off. I have successfully unweathered the factory weathered model to the extent where it looks actually as if it's just been taken into use from a major overhaul. There are several different ways of doing it, but if you start off with one that is already shiny, then you can introduce small areas of weathering by judiciously applying a matte varnish. So boiler bands and cab edges and the running plate, places like that, you can apply a thin, small amount of a matte varnish and then work your weathering on the top of that.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any more questions then?
There is one more from John Bates.
Well, thank you very much for attending, everybody.
There's a question on buffer heads, Mick.
I beg your pardon, Mark?
There is a question here on buffer heads. What would you use on buffer heads to replicate?
Oh, John, yeah. Thank you for reminding me, John. I'd completely forgotten about that. You did ask me this question offline. Maybe let me change the camera back to the one I did before. So this C-class, which is the one is the blue pizza locomotive. This had the buffer heads airbrushed the same colour the rest of the locomotive. In other words, a mixture of frame dirt and roof dirt, which means the buffer heads were covered with the same colour, which of course is how it would happen in real life. Now, quite a few pictures that you see of buffer heads show a blob of discoloration in the centre, which comes from grease. Now, I'm hoping this is going to work. You can go some way towards replicating that by using, in this instance, the black weathering powder. I've just put some on the tip of this brush, and if I'm accurate enough, I can add it to the centre-ish of the buffer head. So now what we appear to have is a buffer head that has started to go rough, but it has that discoloration in the centre from the grease that would have been applied to it. Can you see that? Is that
it's visible, Mick.
Is it in focus though? That's the thing.
Not bad.
Does that answer your question, John?
Yep, that looks good. Thank you.
Okay. Not difficult. It's easier to do than it is to remember.
We've got more questions coming in, Mick. Have you got time to deal with a few?
I've got plenty of time. I'm happy to sit here.
Right. Rob Thompson's asked, would you use different paints or pigments on diesel locos, especially as smoke from them is oilier?
No, I wouldn't. I use the same colours. Yes, the smoke might be oilier, but it's still the same colour by the time it deposits itself on top of things.
Okay.
And that's where it tends to accumulate most, on top of things.
And
thanks, Mick.
There's a question about matte varnish from Barry Mason. When using a matte varnish, what would you thin it and with what?
How long is a piece of string, Barry?
Well, I don't know. I mean, this is new to me.
Okay, the answer to the question really is it depends what varnish you're using and what the effect is that you wish to achieve. I would say that if you're going to use a matte varnish to cover what we're talking about, which is weathering, you would need something very thin. So yes, I would thin it before I started. My preferred varnish, if I want to prepare for or finish off, which is seldom weathering, is actually a matte lacquer, Tester's Dull Coat. And the reason I favour that is it comes in an aerosol, and I'm going to touch wood now, I've never yet had a nozzle clog on me. I pick the tin up, it works straight away. It's consistent and it's convenient.
What would you use as a solvent to thin
Well, that depends on the nature of the varnish I'm using. If I'm using an acrylic varnish, then I'd use acrylic thinners. If I'm using an enamel varnish, then I'd spirit. If it's a lacquer like Tester's Dull Coat, not through an aerosol, I'd use cellulose thinners.
Right, thanks, Mick.
Okay.
Mick, following on from the Tester's Dull Coat question.
Yep.
It's still available. I had a feeling that it's no longer available.
For it. The about it becoming unavailable is because Rust-Oleum, who manufacture it, have ceased exporting from the States. It's an American product. So they've ceased exporting it. For the time being, you would have to or use your favorite search engine to look for sources in the UK. I know that currently Hobby Holidays, well, actually, no, I shouldn't say currently. The places to look for it are Hobby Holidays, E-Models, and I think S&M stuff. There may well be others in the UK. Those are the ones I know of.
Excellent, thank you.
Mick, another question about Dull Coat. David Thorpe says it gives a very heavy spray. Would you transfer it to an airbrush first? Now, I've seen you use it straight from the can. Do you ever warm the cans with Dull Coat?
No, I've never found the need to. Recognizing that an aerosol is a binary device, it's on or it's off, there's no in between, and that you've got no control over the volume it produces either. Just beware and make sure that when you start spraying, you are off the model and you move the can along the model at about that speed. Yeah. And don't stop spraying until you get off the model the other side. Much the same way as I was showing earlier on using an airbrush. It produces a lot and you've got little or no control. As long as you recognize that and practice on something that doesn't matter first, then it's not too difficult to achieve just the level of coverage you need.
Thank you, Mick.
Oh, question from Robin Gristwood, I see. How long will the wealth of videos on the website last? The way to answer that, Robin, is to say until people stop looking at them. As you might imagine, we've got ways of measuring traffic on the website. If we go for 6 months where no one looks at any single video, then we'll get rid of a lot, sort of thing. That's black and white. Obviously, there are areas of grey in between. Any more questions then?
Not a question, Mick, but many, many, many thanks. That was really excellent in showing as much as anything that less is more.
That sounds like Dave White's, is it?
That is me.
Okay. Thank you, Dave. Yeah, very much so. Well, I say very much so. The way I like to do things, and I keep saying this because it is important. What I have shown you is the way I do things, and the reason I've done that is because it works for me. And the way I looked at it in the beginning is, if it works for me, it should work for anybody.
I think that's a very important point you make, actually, Mick. It's what I've done when I've done my demonstrations, and emphasize that it is what works for me, but really what people need to do is to experiment and to try out and find out what will work for them. What we can give them are pointers and guidance, but it's down to the individual modeler to experiment and find out what will really work for them.
Yes, absolutely right, David.
Well, that killed it off, didn't it?
Yeah, it did, didn't it? Yeah. Okay, chaps. Any more? For any more? Okay. Well, I've covered all the things I wanted to cover. As long as you understand that this is just a very brief introduction, and just sort of skimmed the surface, really. Okay, I see no more hands rising or people.
No, there's a question down the bottom about how long the videos on the website are going to be up for.
Yeah, I just answered that, David.
Oh, did you? I beg your pardon. I got muted. No, I got muted, and for some reason I didn't get any sound either. I don't know what Mark's done to me.
That wasn't me.
No.
I think you need to blame your ISP for that one, David.
Right, beg your pardon.
Well, thanks, Mick. It's been a very enjoyable session. Thoroughly enjoyed it and learnt a lot. So thanks very much indeed.
Oh, thanks, Rob. Thanks for coming along.
Okay. See you again sometime.
Thank you very much, Mick. It's been very knowledgeable and taught me a lot already.
Thanks, Barry. That's good to know.
Thanks, Mick.
Yeah. Thanks,
Okay.
Mick. I think I'll buy that airbrush after all.
Well done, Bernard.
Yeah, thanks, Mick.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, chaps.
Thank you. Very enjoyable. Most informative. Thank you.
Thank you, Mick, for the whole weekend. Excellent.
You're welcome, Julian. Glad to see you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks again, Mick. Thank
You're welcome, Derek.
Thank you so much for all the advice.
You're welcome, Sally.
Okay. Look forward to keeping in touch.
Yes, please do. Yeah.
We're on a roll here.
Good.